one but for those at the pinnacle of London society, there were gentlemen's clubs. The fashion of 18th century London gentlemen was to the bribe that won the war 155 belonged to one or more of the gentlemen's clubs. Many of them moved from place to place, others were anchored in a specific tavern or hall. A handful of the clubs were as spectacular as modern-day casinos, and becoming a member was everything to the aristocratic class. Almack's, Brooks, and White's were among the top clubs. Almack's had a large ballroom that could accommodate 1,700 of London's fashionable dandies. Gaining admittance was important to London's young social scene, and the Duke of Wellington was once turned away because he arrived in trousers rather than the required knee breeches. Women were admitted at Almack's, and it became a marriage mart for London's most eligible. The main attraction of the gentlemen's clubs was gambling. At a time when the average wage earner was paid £1 a week, it was not uncommon to see £10,000 sterling on the table. Brooks and White's were strictly men's clubs, and the chief amusement was gambling. They kept an open betting book, where one could wager on anything, and seats at the card tables were occupied all night. Whist, loo, faro, and hazard were the favourite games, and the size of the wagers ruined many of England's young elite. White's and Brooks would occasionally attract members divided by politics, and in the years before the American Revolution Brooks was regarded as a Whig club, and White's a Tory club. White's members included the Duke of Devonshire and the Earl of Rockingham. Brooks' members included Charles James Fox, Lord Robert Spencer, and Sir Joshua Reynolds. Charles Fox may epitomise London's Macaronis. Born with the proverbial silver spoon, Fox's wealth brought him election to the House of Commons at the age of 19. At the time of his election he was travelling throughout the continent, so he did not suffer the boredom of a campaign. In fact, according to his own letters, he was laid up with a bout of the clapping-ice. Back in London, Fox would spend days hopping from Brooks to White's to Almack's to other clubs, where a bad night might cause a loss of £10,000 to £15,000, and a good night might see its return. 156 The lodge in the Revolution. While the Fox family fortune supported such excess, the same could not be said of all of the young dandies who made up the St. James's Club scene of London. A massive gambling debt incurred at the gaming tables of White's in London led to the bribery of the one man whose role would be so pivotal in the final outcome of the Revolutionary War, Sir George Bridges Rodney. Born into a Somerset family that traced its lineage for 20 generations, Rodney studied at Harrow. Like many other naval commanders of his day, he left school at an early age, 12, to train in the Navy. But prestige and profit did not always go hand in hand. An elegant, handsome figure, Rodney was reckoned a gambler without any of the inherited wealth to pay off his losses. The young dandy lost his family's fortune on the playing tables of White's. Even worse than his losses were the debts he incurred. Rodney planned to go to sea, in order to share in the booty that was promised to the commanders. In one early action in the West Indies he was able to partially repair his finances. While the income bought him time, the sea would disappoint him as much as the gaming tables of White's. Rodney spent his remaining funds to get into Parliament, but even this campaign failed. His debts were all too often to men in office, and his connections soon became a detriment to his career. Unable to stay away from White's or gain his finances, Rodney was forced to flee London and his creditors. While in exile in France he heard that he had been picked to head the British Navy. But he owed French creditors as well, and was told he would have to pay off his debts before he left. The prospects were gloomy indeed. Even if he found enough money to get out of France, he could still be thrown in a debtor's prison in England before he even saw a warship. Taking command of the Navy was the light at the end of Rodney's tunnel. In his darkest hour Rodney was approached by a representative of one of the wealthiest families in France. Rodney would be provided with enough money to satisfy his monumental debts, but what was required for such a favour was equally monumental. The bride that won the war 157 Masonic brothers from abroad the winter of 1777 to 1778 was particularly hard for the American army under Washington's command. Many soldiers had little more than blankets to keep out the cold, as their shirts and pants were in tatters. Shoes were a luxury, and many soldiers lost their feet and legs to the cold. Often those on sentry duty stood in their hats to keep their bare feet warmer. The food was so scant that the Thanksgiving treat was 4 ounces of rice cake. Point 2. At the same time, German farmers in nearby Valley Forge were driving cattle to Philadelphia for the British. Washington himself had to contend with the constant excuses of Congress when he pleaded for food, clothing, funds, and medicine. And a handful called the Conway Cabal plotted against Washington. The army was undernourished and poorly clad, and had been forced to retreat from one defeat to another for years. It appeared that, if victory would be had, it would be a miracle. That miracle finally became reality with the arrival of assistance from Europe. The efforts of American agents in Europe brought the French on board as allies. Early in 1778, while Rodney was hiding in Paris, the French had signed an alliance to join the Americans. They would not actually declare war against England until July, however. One of the first conflicts featured the French Navy and the English fleet near the island of Ushant. The two forces were equal, but the English were used to winning. When the French fleet was forced to retreat, the two English commanders somehow confused their signals and also retreated. In a move that was very reminiscent of the numerous land battles fought in America, it appeared that the English refused to press the advantage. Because the battle was so close to home for the English, and the failure was so public, the citizens rioted in the streets of London, and both commanders were court-martialed. Each blamed the other for the failure to exact a victory. The English army appeared unable to press its advantage on land, as well, although the public was less aware of what occurred across the Atlantic. There had been worse blunders. After the war, Sir William 158 the Lodge in the Revolution, how Sir Henry Clinton and Lord Charles Cornwallis were blamed for incompetence. The famous story of Howe sipping tea while letting the defeated Continental Army escape Long Island is one that most likely plagued him. But Howe was competent. He had served with Amherst, who had taught the American commanders, and Howe liked the values of guerrilla fighting. He was a knowledgeable, battle-hardened commander who had fought at Montreal, Louisbourg, and Quebec before the American Revolution. Howe did make serious mistakes. He had allowed Washington, whose army spent the night in the rain without tents and low on ammunition, to escape Long Island. And this was not the last time Howe allowed the American army to escape. He followed Washington across New Jersey, where desertions reduced the small force to less than 10,000. With victory again simply a day away, Howe allowed Washington to cross into Pennsylvania. When winter came, Howe's army was camped within 25 miles of the Americans, but Howe had no desire to shiver through winter in a camp. Instead he headed back to New York City, where his mistress, Elizabeth Loring, kept the general warm. Her husband had been sent by Howe to Boston to watch over the prisons. A London newspaper accusing the general of ineptitude was brought to Howe. He decided to turn in his resignation, and while he waited for it to be accepted, he and Loring enjoyed dinners, concerts, and ballroom dancing in Philadelphia. When Franklin was asked by the French if Howe had taken Philadelphia, Franklin replied that Philadelphia had taken General Howe. 3 Sir Henry Clinton was a military man as well. He started his career at the age of 13 in the Coldstream Guards, where he was commissioned as a lieutenant. He also distinguished himself in battle, and rapidly rose through the ranks to become a major general in 1772. When he took over for Howe, he was more interested in being in New York than in commanding his troops in the field. After the war, Clinton was called on to explain his failure as a commander. He blamed Cornwallis and the other generals, even going as far as writing a book about his actions. He claimed that 3 times his army was in danger of the bribe that won the war 159 of starving, although compared to Washington's forces, starving was a relative term. With £12,000 to cover his salary and expenses, Clinton's provision orders included brandy in 10-gallon lots, beef, veal, mutton, fish, sweetbreads, and eggs. 4 He held 4 houses in New York City, which, he claimed, were used for hiding, because his life was in danger, and he also had a mistress in the city.